I told myself I was just visiting an old friend, but every time she opened the door, I forgot why I'd come. She was my friend's mom. Calm, distant, untouchable, until the night she whispered, "You keep coming back, and I keep letting you." It started with coffee and quiet smiles. It ended with a whisper I still hear every time it rains. Some people make you feel at home the moment you see them. For me, she was home. I never planned to fall for her. I just never learned how to leave. I still remember the first time I stepped into that house at the end of Willow Lane. It wasn't anything grand, just a quiet, sunlit home tucked behind a line of sycamores. But something about it felt different. It was the kind of place where time moved slower, where even silence had warmth. I used to come there for my best friend. We'd spend hours in the living room, gaming, joking, making noise like we owned the world. But looking back, those aren't the moments I remember most. What I remember is her, his mother. She had this calm presence that filled every room before she even spoke. Not loud, not demanding, just steady, like a song you hum without realizing. Her hair was tied loosely most of the time, streaks of silver softening the edges of her dark waves. And her eyes, they carried that kind of peace you only earn after surviving a few storms. Whenever I walked through that door, the air changed. There was always the scent of vanilla and something faintly floral, the kind of smell that stays on your clothes longer than it should. A record player usually played low in the background, old jazz or some quiet acoustic song that made you forget about the rest of the world. She'd greet me with that same gentle smile, one corner of her mouth lifting a little slower than the other. "Hey, sweetheart," she'd say, not to me specifically, but to anyone she cared about. Still, I pretended it meant something. Sometimes she'd hand us lemonade, the glass cool and beaded with condensation. Once, when she passed it to me, her fingers brushed mine, light as a sigh. It was nothing, just a moment too small for words, but it stayed. That's the thing about her. She didn't have to do much. Everything about her was quiet, yet spoke louder than anything else. The days blurred together, school, work, noise, but every visit to that house felt like pressing pause. Even when I wasn't there, I found myself thinking about it. The way the afternoon light fell through the window blinds, the hum of the old refrigerator, the sound of her laughter drifting from the kitchen. I didn't understand it then, why I noticed her so much. I just knew that when she was near, I paid attention. Every gesture, every tone in her voice, every time she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She was older, sure, wiser, grounded. But there was something fragile under that grace, something that made me want to understand her. I didn't know it yet, but those small, ordinary moments, the scent of her candles, the sound of her voice, the way she looked at me without really looking, they were already becoming something I'd never be able to forget. And somehow, deep down, I think she knew it too. It started happening without me meaning to. At first, I'd stop by when my friend wasn't home, maybe to return a borrowed book or drop something off. But the truth is, sometimes I didn't even have a reason. I just find myself walking toward that house, my steps slowing when I reached the porch, hoping she might answer the door. And she always did. Never surprised, never asking why I was there, just that small, knowing smile, the kind that said it's okay, you can come in. Her kitchen became our meeting place. It wasn't fancy, pale yellow walls, mismatched mugs, the faint sound of wine through the open window. But it had a rhythm, a kind of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. She'd be doing something simple, folding laundry on the counter, or chopping vegetables for dinner. I'd sit on the stool by the island, elbows resting on the cool marble, just talking. Sometimes she'd ask about my classes or my plans. Other times, she'd tell stories from years ago, trips she'd taken, mistakes she'd made, people she used to love. The way she talked about life wasn't like listening to an adult lecture you. It was like being handed small truths she'd collected over time, wrapped gently in laughter. When she laughed, it wasn't loud. It was soft and honest, the kind that made her eyes crease slightly at the corners. And whenever she looked at me during those moments, it felt like the whole house leaned in to listen. One afternoon, she asked if I could fix a cabinet hinge that had come loose. I knelt down, screwdriver in hand, while she crouched beside me, holding the door steady. Our fingers brushed over the same metal edge, a quiet, accidental touch. For a second, neither of us moved. I could feel the warmth of her skin, not the kind that shocks you, but the kind that seeps in slow, settling somewhere deeper than you expect. When I looked up, she was already looking at me, not startled, not embarrassed, just still. The moment hung there, silent but alive. Then she smiled faintly, her voice low. "Careful," she said. "Those little screws tend to slip when you least expect it." We both laughed, and just like that, the tension folded back into something safe again. But later, when I left and walked home, I could still feel that brief touch lingering on my hand, like the warmth refused to fade. After that, I found more reasons to stop by. Sometimes I'd bring her coffee. Sometimes she'd have pie cooling on the counter. We never talked about why I came, or why she never told me not to. All I knew was that her kitchen felt like the only place where the world stopped spinning. And when I sat there, listening to her hum softly under her breath, it didn't matter that the rest of the house was empty. It never really felt empty when she was there. It was one of those evenings that felt heavier than it should. Clouds hung low, the kind that made the streetlights flicker early, and the smell of rain pressed against the air like a warning. I was walking home from the bus stop when it started, first a drizzle, then a downpour that soaked me through in seconds. Without thinking, my feet turned down Willow Lane. By the time I reached her porch, water dripped from my hair, my shirt clinging cold against my skin. I hadn't even knocked when the door opened, and there she was, framed in the warm light of her hallway, wearing a loose sweater and that calm, steady look I'd come to know too well. She didn't say anything at first, just took one look at me, sighed softly, and disappeared inside. When she came back, she held a towel. "Come in before you catch something," she murmured. I stepped inside, the house smelling faintly of cinnamon and rain-soaked wood. She handed me the towel, her fingers brushing my wrist, light, careful, but grounding. "You're drenched," she said, a hint of amusement in her tone. "Yeah," I managed, running the towel through my hair. "Guess I didn't plan very far ahead." "You never do," she teased gently, her lips curving. Then, after a pause, "Sit. I'll make tea." We ended up on the porch again, her idea, even though the rain was still falling, steady and rhythmic. The air was cool, mist clinging to the edges of her hair. She handed me a mug, the steam curling up between us. For a while, we just listened. The rain on the roof, the hum of the night. It was peaceful in that strange, charged way silence sometimes is. She broke it first. "You come by a lot lately," she said, her tone soft but measured. I hesitated, staring into the swirl of tea. "Yeah, I guess I do." "Why?" The question hung there, not sharp, just honest. I didn't know how to answer. "Because it's easy here. Because you make it feel like the world slows down. Because I can't seem to stop thinking about you." But all I said was, "I like the quiet." She studied me for a moment, eyes steady. The porch light flickered across her face, the fine lines near her mouth, the calm in her gaze, the faint trace of something else I couldn't quite name. When thunder rolled in the distance, she looked out toward the rain, her voice lower now. "You make this house feel alive again," I said quietly, not even sure if I meant to. Her eyes flicked back to mine, surprised, maybe, but not startled. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, almost a whisper, "Don't say things like that." The way she said it wasn't a scolding, more like a plea. Still, she didn't tell me to leave. We just sat there, side by side, the sound of rain between us, both knowing something had shifted, even if neither of us dared to name it. After that night on the porch, something changed between us, not in words, but in everything else. We didn't talk about it. We didn't need to. But every time I walked down Willow Lane, I caught myself slowing near her gate, as if some quiet part of me was waiting for permission to stop again. And every time she gave it. One afternoon, I saw her in the yard. The sun was high, the kind that softens everything it touches. She was kneeling by the flower bed, her hands deep in the soil, strands of hair falling loose around her face. She looked peaceful, untouchable. But when she noticed me at the fence, her expression softened, that small, knowing smile again. "Back so soon," she teased. I shrugged. "You make this place hard to stay away from." She laughed, low and warm. That sounds like trouble. I slipped through the gate to join her. Without asking, I knelt beside her, hands finding their way into the soil beside hers. The ground was cool and damp, the smell of earth rich and clean. We worked in silence, planting new stems, brushing shoulders now and then. It was strange how something as ordinary as gardening could feel so intimate. The distance between us seemed smaller than ever, and yet there was still that quiet line neither of us crossed. After a while, she leaned back on her heels, brushing her palms on her jeans. "I used to do this with my husband," she said softly. "He was the one who taught me to plant without worrying if things would last." There was no sadness in her voice, just a kind of acceptance that comes after a long goodbye. I looked at her, trying to find the right words, but all I managed was, "He must have been lucky." Her eyes met mine for a moment, searching, unreadable. Then she smiled faintly. "Maybe, but luck runs out eventually." A breeze passed between us, carrying the scent of fresh soil and lilacs. I wanted to tell her how much these afternoons meant to me, how her company felt like the calm I'd been chasing for years. But the words stayed caught somewhere behind my ribs. When we finished, she stood and brushed off her hands. I noticed a smudge of dirt on her cheek. Without thinking, I reached up and wiped it away with my thumb. She froze, not pulling back, just still. Her eyes lifted to mine, soft but steady. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then she stepped back, her voice quiet but certain. "You should go," she said. "It's getting late." I nodded, though I didn't move right away. And when I finally turned to leave, I could feel her gaze following. It was a Friday evening, the kind that carried a quietness you could feel. The sky outside was pale and heavy, and her house glowed softly from the inside like a lantern against the dusk. I hadn't seen her in nearly a week, not since that afternoon in the garden. I told myself I was just stopping by to check in. My friend had mentioned she wasn't feeling well, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. When she opened the door, she looked tired but beautiful in that effortless way she always did. Her sweater hung loose at the sleeves, and her hair was tied back carelessly, like she hadn't bothered to look in the mirror. "You shouldn't have come out in this weather," she said softly. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." She hesitated, then smiled. "You always say that like you mean it." "Ido." Something in her expression softened, that familiar mix of affection and caution. She stepped aside, letting me in. The house was dimly lit, a single lamp by the couch painting everything in gold. We sat there, close but not too close, a quiet hum between us. She had a blanket over her legs, a mug of tea resting in her hands. The air smelled faintly of chamomile and rain. "How have you been?" I asked. She gave a small shrug. "Tired. Some days just feel heavier than others." Her voice was steady, but I could hear the loneliness underneath, the kind you only notice when you've been listening long enough. I nodded slowly. "I get that." She looked at me then, really looked. "You're kind," she said. "Too kind, maybe, for someone who doesn't know what he wants yet." Her words lingered, almost teasing, but edged with truth. I felt something inside me tighten. "I know what I want," I said quietly. "I just don't know if I should." The room went still. The clock ticked in the corner, marking every heartbeat. She didn't move, but her eyes flicked down, for the briefest moment, to my lips. Then, just as quickly, she looked away, a faint tremor in her breath. "You should go," she whispered, "before either of us says something we can't take back." I stood slowly, unsure if my legs would cooperate. But as I reached the door, she called after me, her voice low, unsteady. "You keep coming back," she said. I turned, and she met my eyes. "And I keep letting you." There was a softness in her words. Not surrender, not regret, just truth. A quiet confession hidden in plain sight. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, the kind of nod that says I know. Then I stepped out into the cool night air, the door closing behind me like a sigh. And for the first time, I realized she wasn't the only one letting it happen. Spring came slowly that year. The air was softer, the trees along Willow Lane green again, and the scent of lilacs drifted through the wind like something familiar returning home. I hadn't seen her in months. Life had started to pull me forward. Work, New plans, a different city, waiting somewhere ahead. But before I left, I knew I had to see her. Not for answers, not for closure, just to say goodbye in a way that felt right. When I walked up to her porch again, everything looked the same. The same wooden steps, the same potted plants, the same faint hum of a radio playing through the open window. For a moment, it almost felt like time had folded back on itself. Then the door opened, and there she was, framed by sunlight, looking exactly as I remembered. For a heartbeat, we just stood there, smiling the kind of smile that comes after everything has been said, even if the words never made it out loud. "I was wondering when you'd show up again," she said gently. "I didn't want to leave without saying goodbye." "Leaving?" I nodded. "Got an offer out of town. I think it's time." Something flickered in her eyes, pride, maybe mixed with that quiet sadness people carry when they lose something they never really had to begin with. "I'm happy for you," she said, and I could tell she meant it. We sat together on the porch, mugs of tea between us, the afternoon light shifting through the trees. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was peaceful, familiar, like a song that had finally found its ending. She told me about her garden, how the tulips had come early, how she'd been painting again. I listened, memorizing every small detail, the rhythm of her voice, the soft curve of her smile, the way the light brushed her hair. When it was time to go, I stood slowly. She rose too, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then she reached out, fingertips resting lightly on my sleeve. Her touch was gentle, steady, grounding, the way it had always been. "I'll miss the sound of your footsteps," she said quietly. I smiled. "Then maybe I'll visit again someday." She looked at me for a long time, not with longing, but with something softer. Understanding. Gratitude. And then she nodded. "I'll probably let you." There was no tension left. Noche, no Unspoken. Just peace. Two people who had found something rare in each other and learned when to let it rest. As I walked down the lane, the breeze carried the faint scent of her garden behind me. And for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like something that simply found its place, quiet, steady, and unforgettable.